My mother raised her champagne glass before anyone asked for a toast, because waiting for permission had never been part of her personality. "Ladies and gentlemen," Priscilla Pendleton announced, smiling like the mansion had personally chosen her. "Bernard always knew how to take care of his family. He left me everything that truly mattered." A wave of polite applause rolled across the terrace. Crystal chandeliers reflected against floor-to-ceiling windows. White-jacketed servers floated between nearly 150 guests, carrying trays of imported champagne that cost more per bottle than the monthly payment on my first pickup truck. Someone from a jazz quartet was playing softly in the corner, while photographers circled the crowd looking for expensive smiles. The mansion itself sat high above Savannah's historic cliffs, every brick restored, every column perfectly painted. Realtors had valued it at just over $4 million 6 months earlier. Tonight, my mother treated that number like a medal she had earned. Across from her stood Charles and Evelyn Blackwell, the wealthy parents of Tiffany's fiancé. "I'm sure Tiffany will feel perfectly at home here," Evelyn said. "Oh, absolutely," my mother replied. "Our family has always believed in preserving quality." I almost laughed when I heard that later. Quality. That word had never applied to people in my mother's dictionary, only neighborhoods, jewelry, schools, and bank accounts. Tiffany lifted her left hand for what had to be the 20th time that evening. The diamond caught another camera flash. 3.8 carats, she said before anyone even asked. Oliver designed the setting himself. One woman leaned closer. "It must have cost a fortune." Tiffany shrugged with rehearsed modesty. "I never asked." Of course she knew. She probably knew the receipt down to the penny. Someone complimented my mother's silk gown. "It came from Milan," she answered. "Custom work. They only made one." She loved sentences that began with money and ended with exclusivity. I wasn't there to hear the beginning of the party. My flight landed less than 90 minutes earlier after I had spent weeks attached to a logistic reconstruction team overseas. I skipped baggage claim because everything I'd owned for the trip fit inside one military duffel ball bag that looked exactly like it had survived several countries. Because it had. Mud stains still covered one side. The shoulder strap had been stitched twice. Inside that bag sat the only thing I cared about bringing home. Dad's old wooden toolbox. Nobody at the airport had looked twice at it. I wished the same could be said for my family. Before climbing the front steps, I stopped for 1 second and rested my hand on the worn canvas. Dad had told me something years ago while sanding a cabinet in his workshop. People who judge your hands usually haven't built anything. He never raised his voice when he taught lessons. He never had to. I pulled open the front gate and walked toward the reception. Conversation slowed before I reached the terrace. Not because anyone recognized me, because I didn't belong in the picture. Everyone wore tailored suits or evening gowns. I wore a plain beige trench coat over my civilian clothes and carried a dirty army duffel that looked like it belonged in a cargo aircraft instead of a millionaire's celebration. One waiter offered me sparkling water. Another assumed I was making a delivery. Neither bothered me. The third person to notice me was my mother. Her smile disappeared so quickly, I almost admired the speed. She excused herself from the Blackwells and intercepted me before I reached the center of the terrace. "Audrey." No hug, no welcome home, just my name. "I made it," I said. "I can see that." Her eyes moved from my boots to the duffel bag. "You couldn't have cleaned that thing first." It carried everything I needed. It also carried dirt. A few nearby guests stopped pretending not to listen. My mother lowered her voice just enough to sound polite. "I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow," I texted Tiffany. My sister looked over with perfect timing. Oh, that single word carried all the enthusiasm of an overdue parking ticket. I forgot. I believed her. Remembering me had never been high on Tiffany's priority list. My mother turned toward the growing audience. "This is my older daughter, Audrey." Several people smiled. Then my mother added the sentence that made every smile change. "She works one of those government office jobs. Mostly paperwork. A low-level desk clerk who shuffles paper for tax dollars." A few guests nodded politely. One man said, "Public service is important." My mother answered before I could. "I'm sure somebody has to file all those forms." Soft laughter. Not loud enough to be rude. Just loud enough to sting. I looked directly at her. She honestly believed that was my life. Or maybe she preferred that version. It sounded much better than admitting the daughter she ignored had spent more than a decade rebuilding roads, bridges, and supply corridors while people shot at them. My job had never been something I discussed at family dinners, mostly because nobody asked. My mother reached toward my shoulder, not to hug me, to take the duffel bag. "This can't stay here. I've got it." "No." She pulled harder than I expected. The bag slipped from my shoulder. Its weight nearly surprised her. "What on earth is in this thing?" "My belongings." She didn't wait for another answer. She waved toward a passing waiter. "You." The young man hurried over. "Yes, ma'am? Take this." She handed him my duffel as if it were leaking garbage. "Set it next to the service trash behind the kitchen. I don't want it ruining the aesthetic of my perfect family portrait." The waiter hesitated. He looked at me, then at her, then back at me. "I'm sorry, ma'am. It's fine," I told him. He wasn't the one making the decision. He carried the bag away. Every step he took pulled my attention toward one particular pocket buried beneath the worn canvas. Inside rested Dad's toolbox. Hidden inside that toolbox was something he had once told me never to lose, no matter who asked for it, no matter how many years passed. At the time, I thought he was talking about an old keepsake. Standing there while my mother smiled for another photograph, I realized he had been protecting something much bigger. And before this night was over, that forgotten object was going to decide who truly owned everything surrounding us. I turned away before anyone could mistake my silence for surrender. The music faded with every step I took toward the service hallway. Crystal chandeliers gave way to fluorescent ceiling lights. Polished marble changed into gray tile, and the smell of expensive perfume disappeared beneath the scent of industrial floor cleaner and fresh coffee. It was almost funny. The people in the ballroom spent thousands creating the illusion of perfection, while everything that kept the evening running happened back here where nobody wanted to look. My duffel bag sat exactly where my mother had ordered, right beside 2 black trash bins. The young waiter who had carried it over spotted me and immediately looked embarrassed. "I'm really sorry," he said. "I asked if there was somewhere better to leave it." I smiled. "You did more than most people would. I figured it might have something valuable inside." "It does." He nodded once. "I didn't touch it." "I know." He hurried back toward the kitchen, probably relieved that I wasn't about to make his shift any worse than it already was. I crouched beside the bag and laid my palm across the rough canvas. The fabric felt exactly the way I remembered. Dirt from 2 continents still clung to the seams. One corner had a faded stain from hydraulic fluid that never completely washed out. Another carried a scratch from a cargo pallet that had broken loose during an airlift. Then my fingertips rested over the section where my father's toolbox sat inside. My pulse jumped, not because of my mother's insult, because for a split second I pictured that bag landing hard against concrete, the toolbox cracking open, and everything my father had protected becoming public before I even knew what it was. I could feel my heartbeat climbing faster than it should. Combat had taught me something long before family dinners ever did. Your body doesn't care whether the threat is incoming mortar fire or public humiliation. Adrenaline arrives the same way. Training decides what happens next. I closed my eyes, 4 seconds in, hold, 4 seconds out, hold, again, 4, 4, 4, 4. The box breathing drill had become automatic years ago in the Hindu Kush, while my engineering team worked beneath the shell of a half-finished supply bridge. Mortar rounds had landed close enough to shake steel beams loose from their temporary braces. One young lieutenant couldn't stop shaking long enough to reconnect a load-bearing support cable. Everyone looked at me, not because I outranked them, because someone had to stay calm. I remembered planting both boots into the mud, counting each breath inside my helmet until my hands stopped trembling. Only then did I pick up the wrench. That bridge carried food, fuel, and medical supplies less than 18 hours later. The breathing worked then. It worked now. When I opened my eyes again, the hallway looked exactly the same. Nothing had changed except me. I lifted the duffel onto my shoulder. Heavy. Solid. Still mine. A catering employee pushed a cart loaded with silver trays past me. "Need a hand?" he asked. "I'm good." He looked toward the ballroom entrance. "Rich folks?" I chuckled. "Something like that. They always make us use the back halls. I've noticed." He grinned. "At least back here, nobody complains if your shoes get dirty." That line reminded me more of my father than he could have known. Dad never judged people by where they stood. He judged them by what they did once they got there. I reached up to adjust my collar after the duffel shifted against my shoulder. The top button of my trench coat slipped open. Cool air brushed across my left shoulder. The scar caught the fluorescent light for less than a second, jagged, raised, about 4 inches long. An old reminder that 7.62mm rounds don't care about intentions. A dishwasher walking past glanced at it. Damn. I looked down and fastened the collar again. It healed. He gave a slow whistle. Didn't look like it wanted to. No, it hadn't. Neither had the memory. The specialist I dragged behind that concrete retaining wall had been 23 years old, fresh out of Texas. He kept apologizing while I pulled him. I'm slowing you down. No, you're not. I can't feel my leg. You'll complain about it later. He laughed. That laugh told me he was still conscious. A second shot hit my shoulder before either of us reached cover. The medic later called me stubborn. Dad would have called it finishing the job. He never glorified pain. He respected responsibility. That difference mattered. I carried the bag farther down the hallway until I found an empty service alcove. For a moment, the sounds from the ballroom became muffled, just enough silence to think. Dad's workshop used to sound like this, not quiet, focused, a planer humming, sandpaper sliding across oak, the click of measuring squares against fresh lumber. I could still hear him correcting me without raising his voice. Measure twice. I'd roll my eyes, I already did. So measure again. Sometimes I'd argue. He'd hand the tape measure back anyway. I usually found the mistake. He wasn't teaching carpentry. He was teaching discipline. One afternoon, after I smashed my thumb trying to rush through a cabinet frame, I threw the hammer across the room. Dad walked over, picked it up, and placed it back on the bench. You know why tools outlive tempers? I shook my aching hand. Why? They don't waste energy proving they're right. That lesson stayed with me longer than any piece of furniture we ever built. My mother taught the opposite. She believed whoever talked the loudest won. Whoever embarrassed someone first stayed in control. Dad built people, Mom compared them. At birthday dinners, Tiffany always sat beside her. I usually sat across from Dad. Not because anyone assigned seats, because somehow that's where I always ended up. Mom would brag about Tiffany's pageants, her grades, her outfits, her friends. Then she'd glance toward me. Audrey doesn't need compliments. She's too tough. Everyone laughed like it was affectionate. Dad never laughed. Sometimes he'd quietly slide another dinner roll onto my plate. Other times he'd ask about the project I was working on instead. He couldn't stop every sentence my mother spoke, but he always found small ways to remind me I hadn't disappeared. Funny how those tiny moments become the ones you remember after someone is gone. A burst of applause echoed from the ballroom again. Another toast, another celebration built on a story my mother believed belonged to her. I tightened my grip on the duffel strap. She thought she'd thrown away something that embarrassed her family. What she had really done was send me straight towards the one place where I could finally open the bag without anyone watching. I walked out the service entrance without looking back and kept going until the music was nothing more than a dull vibration behind the mansion. My old Ford F-150 sat where I had parked it along the far edge of the driveway, away from the imported SUVs and polished luxury sedans lined up for the valet. The truck had 247,318 miles on the odometer, a cracked cup holder, and a heater that only worked when it felt generous. Dad used to joke that if a truck started every morning, it didn't owe you anything else. A light rain tapped against the windshield as I climbed inside. The cab smelled like canvas, coffee, and motor oil. It smelled honest. I locked both doors out of habit before sliding the duffel bag onto the passenger seat. For several seconds, I simply looked at it. The whole evening had revolved around appearances. My mother's gown, Tiffany's ring, the mansion, the champagne, the guests. Nobody cared what was inside anything. Dad always did. I unzipped the duffel slowly. The zipper caught near the middle, exactly where it always had after getting packed with fine desert dust years earlier. I pulled a little harder until it gave way with a familiar rasp. There it was, his toolbox. Not some expensive collector's piece. Just a medium-sized wooden toolbox built from American walnut with maple drawer runners and hand-cut dovetail joints. So clean they almost disappeared into the grain. Every edge had been softened by years of use instead of decorative sanding. Dad built it for himself long before I was born. When I was little, I thought it was magical because every tool inside always fit perfectly. As an adult, I realized that wasn't magic. That was patience. I lifted the box onto my lap. It weighed almost as much as I remembered. The brass handle had darkened with age, where his fingers had wrapped around it thousands of times. Without thinking, I traced one dovetail joint with my thumb. Every corner had been cut by hand, no gaps, no filler, no shortcuts. Dad's used to hand me scraps of pine after school. See those joints? I'd nod. They're the first thing another carpenter notices, so they have to be perfect? He smiled. They have to be honest. I didn't understand that answer when I was 10. I did now. Honest work still showed itself years later. Dishonest work usually needed paint. A laugh escaped me before I could stop it. Mom would have hated that sentence. She believed paint solved almost everything, including people. When Dad passed away, I had been overseas. By the time emergency leave was approved and I made it home, most of his workshop had already been emptied. My mother called it decluttering. I called it erasing. Cabinets gone, workbench sold. His old drill press disappeared. The shelves he built himself had been ripped off the wall because they looked too rustic. The toolbox was the only thing I managed to rescue. She almost donated that too. If you want your father's old junk, she'd said, take it now. So I did. Every mile afterward, it traveled with me. Germany, Colorado, Kuwait. Back again. It wasn't furniture anymore. It was the last room in my father's workshop that still existed. Rain grew heavier outside. Water slid across the windshield in crooked lines while the mansion glowed in the distance like a luxury hotel. Inside that house, people toasted an inheritance. Inside my truck, I wanted answers. I rested the toolbox on the center console and studied the lower right corner. Most people would never notice it. A tiny brass pin sat almost flush with the wood, smaller than the head of a finished nail. Dad had shown it to me once, only once. I could still picture him kneeling beside me. If anyone ever tells you every compartment is visible, he'd said, they've never met a carpenter. I laughed. Does this one have a secret? He leaned closer and lowered his voice like we were planning a bank robbery. Every good toolbox keeps one. He pressed the pin. The hidden panel opened with a quiet click. Then he closed it again. Don't show anybody. I won't. Promise? I promise. At 10 years old, I assumed he hid candy inside. Kids don't think about legal documents. Adults do. I found the brass pin beneath my fingertip. For the first time in nearly 24 years, I pressed it. Nothing happened. I frowned. Dad had always told me not to force fine craftsmanship. I released the pressure, shifted the box slightly, pressed again. Click. The sound was almost too soft to hear. A hidden panel lifted less than half an inch. My heartbeat climbed. I carefully slid the false bottom upward. Inside rested two things. The first was a thick official envelope made from cream-colored paper, perfectly preserved inside a waxed protective sleeve. A dark red wax seal still held the flap closed. The second was a small leather ledger tied with faded cotton string. Neither looked old enough to have spent years hidden inside wood. Dad had prepared them carefully. Very carefully. I picked up the envelope first. My name wasn't written across the front. Neither was my mother's. There was only Bernard's neat handwriting. Her original documents. Nothing else. I broke the wax seal with my thumb. The paper inside unfolded smoothly. Professional. Heavy stock. County certification stamp. Official signatures. Recording information. I recognized the format immediately. It wasn't a will. It wasn't a trust amendment. It was a warranty deed. I read the property description once. Then again. Historic Parcels 18B. Savannah. Every legal boundary matched the estate sitting less than 200 yards away. I skipped to the ownership pits section. The breath caught in my throat. Grantor, Bernard William Pendleton. Below it, grantee, Audrey Elaine Pendleton as her sole and separate property. I stared at the words until they blurred. No, I forced myself to slow down, read everything. The recording number, the county clerk's certification, the notarization, the filing date. Months before Dad died, not after. Months before. This wasn't something forgotten in probate. This wasn't an unfinished draft. It had already been legally recorded. The mansion everyone inside believed my mother had inherited had never belonged to her. Not for a single day. I leaned back against the driver's seat while rain hammered the roof. Every conversation from the terrace replayed in my mind. My husband left me everything. Our family estate. My inheritance. Every word had been spoken with complete confidence, or complete ignorance. Then I looked down at the leather ledger still resting inside the hidden compartment. If Dad had hidden the deed this carefully, the notebook beside it almost certainly explained why. I set the warranty deed back inside the envelope before my hands could do something careless. Dad had spent years protecting those papers. They weren't staying out in the open because I was overwhelmed. The leather ledger stayed where it was for the moment. One question had already taken over every other thought. If the mansion legally belonged to me, why had Mom been acting like it was hers? I slipped both documents back into the hidden compartment and closed the false bottom until it clicked into place. The toolbox looked ordinary again, just another carpenter's box that had seen decades of work. Outside, another line of luxury cars rolled toward the front entrance. Valet jogged through the rain with umbrellas, while guests laughed under the covered portico. Inside my truck, nobody knew the entire foundation of tonight's celebration had just cracked. My phone vibrated against the center console. One short buzz, then another. The screen lit up with the dark green interface of my encrypted credit monitoring app. Priority alert: potential mortgage-related activity detected. That wasn't a notification I ignored. Years of holding security clearance had trained me to treat unusual financial activity the same way I treated unusual movement on a surveillance feed. Don't assume, verify. I unlocked the app using biometric authentication. Another notification expanded automatically. New inquiry associated with real property financing. My stomach tightened. I hadn't applied for a mortgage. I hadn't opened a line of credit. I hadn't signed anything. I tapped the alert. A transaction reference number appeared along with a county filing identifier. Someone had requested information connected to the Savannah property. That made no sense. Unless I opened another secure application that monitored public property records and identity activity. Military life had taught me to expect attempts at fraud. Service members deployed overseas made attractive targets because criminals assumed they weren't paying attention. They usually picked the wrong people. A search pulled county filings connected to the property. Nothing unusual. Another search looked for pending financing disclosures. Still nothing. I expanded the advanced search options: hidden sales, pre-closing submissions, preliminary lender packages. There, a document appeared with restricted public visibility until closing. My heartbeat stayed steady this time. Training: read first, react later. The lender was one I'd never heard of. Atlantic Heritage Capital, loan type, cash out, refinance, half requested amount, $500,000. I blinked once, not because of the number, because the borrower names were wrong. Priscilla Pendleton. Bernard Pendleton. I read Bernard's name again. Dad had been dead for months. Dead people don't refinance houses, unless someone says they do. I opened the supporting documents. The first signature page appeared. Bernard's signature sat neatly at the bottom. Except it wasn't Bernard's. It looked close, dangerously close. The letters leaned a little too far forward. His capital B always curved back toward itself. This one didn't. Dad signed thousands of documents during his contracting career. I'd watched him enough times to recognize the difference. Someone had copied his handwriting, poorly. I kept scrolling. Another page loaded. My name appeared. Audrey Elaine Pendleton. Directly beneath it, my signature. Except I had never signed it, not once. A cold silence settled inside the truck. Not panic, not fear, recognition. This wasn't family drama anymore. This was identity theft. I downloaded every available document into encrypted storage before opening the application history. Applicant notes, income estimates, credit verification, property valuation. Then I reached the borrower profile, occupation, unemployed. I laughed, actually laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. Some loan officer somewhere believed I was unemployed while simultaneously using my credit profile to secure $2.5 million. That took confidence. Or stupidity, possibly both. The listed contact number belonged to my mother's house. The backup email belonged to Tiffany. My sister hadn't even bothered creating a separate account. The wedding budget finally started making sense. Over the past year, Tiffany's social media had become an endless parade of luxury tastings, designer fittings, destination planning, imported flowers, and private vineyard tour. One rehearsal dinner venue alone reportedly required a non-refundable deposit of $87,100. People whispered about how fortunate she was. Nobody asked where the money came from. I opened another financial report, credit card balances, not mine. Priscilla's, 4 accounts. One carried a balance of $61,842.17. Another sat at $48,955. Tiffany's cards weren't much better. Designer boutiques, jewelry stores, luxury travel agencies. A wedding planner in Charleston had billed $142,600 in staged installments over 6 months. They weren't living comfortably. They were drowning beautifully. I followed the lender timeline. Application submitted, income verified, Property appraisal completed conditional approval. Estimated closing, January 3, just after New Year's, 3 days away. By then, the money would already be moving. Another attached note from the loan processor caught my attention. Final owner verification waived based on submitted documentation, waived. Because whoever submitted the package convinced them ownership was already settled. I leaned back and closed my eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Dad's deed, Mom's party, the fake inheritance, the refinancing, the forged signatures. Suddenly, every piece fit together. They never expected me to question anything. In my mother's version of the family, I was the daughter who disappeared into government work, came home once or twice a year, and minded her own business. She thought I shuffled paperwork. Tiffany thought I lived alone because nobody could stand me. Neither of them understood what my actual job required. For more than a decade, I'd been trained to reconstruct supply networks, identify weak links, verify documentation, and investigate discrepancies before they became disasters. Finding inconsistencies wasn't a hobby. It was my profession. I opened one final attachment, property ownership certification. Someone had altered enough paperwork to convince the lender that my mother possessed clear authority over the estate. It was clever, not clever enough. Because the original warranty deeds sitting 6 inches away inside Dad's toolbox destroyed every page of their application. I looked toward the brightly lit mansion through the rain-speckled windshield. Guests inside were still celebrating an inheritance that legally didn't exist. Mom thought the biggest risk tonight was me embarrassing her in front of wealthy friends. She had no idea the real threat wasn't standing in her ballroom anymore. It was sitting inside an old Ford truck with the original deed, copies of every fraudulent loan document, and enough evidence to make someone else's New Year's celebration end in handcuffs instead of champagne. I drove away from the mansion before anyone noticed my truck had been sitting in the same spot for nearly an hour. 5 miles later, I checked into a roadside motel called the Harbor Lantern Inn. It wasn't charming, and it wasn't trying to be. The carpet had seen better decades, the air conditioner hummed louder than necessary, and the front desk clerk handed me a metal room key instead of a key card. Perfect. I wasn't looking for comfort, I was looking for privacy. The room had one small desk pressed against the window. Within 15 minutes, it stopped looking like a motel room and started looking like a field operations center. My government-issued, secure laptop sat in the middle. The warranty deed rested inside a waterproof document sleeve beside it. Dad's toolbox stayed within arm's reach on the second chair. Yellow legal pads filled with handwritten notes slowly replaced the complimentary coffee tray. Old habits die hard. Whenever a reconstruction mission began overseas, my first job wasn't moving equipment. It was understanding the system, who supplied what, where the money moved, which records disagreed with each other. People lied, paper usually didn't. I powered on the encrypted laptop and authenticated through my security token. Several classified applications remained inaccessible outside government networks, but my forensic financial software was privately licensed and completely legal to use with my own records. I wasn't hacking anyone. I was following my own financial trail. There was a huge difference. The first search mapped every automatic transfer connected to my personal accounts over the previous 24 months. Most entries were exactly what I expected. Retirement contributions, insurance premiums, savings, federal withholding. Then one recurring transfer caught my attention. Monthly, same amount, always processed on the second business day. The receiving institution wasn't identified by name, only a trust account number. I frowned. Dad had always been meticulous with paperwork. If he created a trust, there had to be documentation somewhere. I reached for the leather ledger from the toolbox. The cotton string untied easily, and inside, every page was written in Dad's unmistakable handwriting. No dramatic speeches, no emotional confessions. Just dates, account numbers, payment schedules, notes, exactly the way a contractor kept records. About halfway through, I found the heading, Protective Blind Trust. My eyes moved faster. Dad explained everything in short sentences. He had established the trust after receiving his medical diagnosis. Its purpose was simple: protect the Savannah property until ownership transferred completely, prevent unnecessary disputes, maintain all financial obligations automatically. The trust manager, not my mother, controlled every scheduled payment. Another page listed funding sources, retirement investments, rental income from 2 commercial workshops Dad had owned years earlier, Then, several months later, a handwritten update appeared. Additional funding authorized by Audrey's voluntary military allotment. I stopped reading. No, that couldn't be right. I opened my banking records again, cross-referenced the trust account number. It matched. Every month, without fail. I remembered filling out voluntary allotment paperwork before one overseas deployment. Dad had asked if I'd consider helping preserve one long-term family obligation. He never said what it was. I didn't ask. I trusted him. I assumed it involved medical expenses or maintenance on the house while he recovered. Instead, I zoomed into the transaction history. Hazard pay allocation, monthly transfer, direct deposit into the trust. For 2 years, I grabbed a calculator. The total reached well into 6 figures. The room became very quiet, not because of the amount, because of what that money represented. Hazard pay isn't a bonus. It's compensation for working where rockets, roadside bombs, and sniper fire are ordinary occupational risks. Every dollar carried memories, cold nights, emergency bridge repairs, convoys, names carved into memorial walls. My mother's roof hadn't been protected by wealth. It had been protected by the places that paid me extra because people were actively trying to kill us. I kept reading. The trust's outgoing payments appeared in perfect order. County property taxes, mortgage installments, insurance, historic preservation fees. Everything was current. Every bill had been paid on time. None of them by my mother. I searched county tax records anyway. Confirmed. No late penalties, no missed installments, no payment plans. Everything matched Dad's ledger. I leaned back and stared at the motel ceiling. Then another memory surfaced. About 8 months earlier, Mom had called me unexpectedly. Audrey, I don't understand why you never contribute to this family. I was standing inside a shipping yard halfway around the world. I send birthday gifts. I'm talking about real responsibility. What do you need? Nothing. Tiffany and I always figure things out ourselves. Then she'd hung up. I almost smiled. She had no idea I had already been helping for nearly 2 years. She just didn't know it. Dad made sure of that. The ledger answered why. One short sentence. Do not disclose funding source until absolutely necessary. Pride can be expensive. Peace is worth more. That sounded exactly like him. Always trying to preserve dignity, even for people who hadn't earned it. I opened another financial mapping program. This one reconstructed outgoing spending patterns from publicly available records, credit disclosures, and legally accessible commercial databases. Slowly, a picture emerged. Priscilla wasn't wealthy. She was leveraged. Country club dues, luxury vehicle leases, private event deposits, designer retailers, high-interest revolving balances. Everything depended on cash flow continuing uninterrupted. Remove one support beam, the entire structure collapsed. Then Tiffany's spending appeared. Wedding planner, florist, custom invitations, European honeymoon deposits. A rehearsal dinner at an oceanfront resort. The projected wedding budget had crossed $600,000. They weren't spending inherited money. They were spending money they expected to borrow. Money secured against a house they didn't own. I exported every record into organized evidence folders. Ownership, mortgage, trust, bank activity, fraud timeline, identity theft. Each file received timestamps and verification notes. Military logistics teaches you one simple rule. If someone can't attack our facts, you've already lost. Every document needed to survive scrutiny from attorneys, investigators, and bankers. As I organized the evidence, something occurred to me. What happened here was unbelievable on its own, but it also reminded me of another family case that unraveled layer by layer until the final truth was even harder to believe. If you're watching this, keep an eye on the top right corner of your screen between minutes 45 and 55. That story connects in a way you probably won't expect. I saved the last folder and closed the laptop. Outside, the motel parking lot was almost empty. Inside the mansion cross town, my mother was probably still entertaining guests who admired her success. None of them realized her elegant life had been balanced on a support system she never saw. My father's planning, my deployments, my hazard pay, my sacrifices. The woman who introduced me as a useless government paper pusher had been sleeping under a roof kept over her head by money earned in places where every sunrise was never guaranteed. She thought she had spent years carrying me. The records proved the exact opposite. I zipped the evidence folder closed, placed it inside my messenger case, and drove back toward the mansion knowing I wasn't returning as a daughter looking for acceptance. I was returning as the only legal owner of the property. The irony almost made me smile. The mansion looked even brighter than it had 2 nights earlier. Every column was wrapped in warm white lights, and the ballroom windows glowed against the dark Savannah sky. Valets hurried between luxury cars, while photographers positioned themselves near the front entrance to capture the city's most influential families arriving for the New Year's Heritage Gala. Mom had always loved symbolic dates. She said people remembered announcements made on holidays. Tonight wasn't just another party, it was the final performance before her refinancing closed. I parked my old truck well away from the entrance. No matter how expensive the neighborhood became, my truck still found the cheapest parking spot. Dad would have approved. Inside the foyer, a hostess glanced at my trench coat before checking the guest list. "I'm here for Priscilla Pendleton." She looked uncertain. Before she could ask another question, one of the event coordinators hurried over. "Oh, you're Audrey." His expression changed into professional discomfort. "Mrs. Pendleton left instructions." "I'm sure she did." He lowered his voice. "She asked that you use the service entrance and remain in the catering area for the evening." I nodded. "What reason did she give?" He hesitated. Then he answered anyway. "She said she didn't want the family embarrassed." I almost felt sorry for him. He clearly hated repeating it. "Thanks for telling me. I really am sorry. You don't owe me an apology." He relaxed a little. People often confuse delivering bad news with creating it. He had done neither. I walked through the same service hallway where my duffel bag had been left beside the trash bins 2 nights earlier. Several kitchen staff recognized me. The young waiter from before smiled. "You came back." "I did." He looked toward the ballroom. "Big night, so I've heard." He leaned closer. "Your mom's been talking about investors all afternoon." "Investors?" "Some development company. Historic properties or something." "Interesting." So the refinancing wasn't the endgame, it was the fuel. A head chef pointed toward a tray of champagne flutes. "You mind giving us a hand for a minute?" "Happy to." For nearly 20 minutes, I carried serving trays through the edge of the ballroom. Nobody looked twice. Invisible people usually have the best view. Conversations drifted past me naturally. Luxury coastal redevelopment, historic preservation tax incentives, exclusive membership opportunities. Future hospitality expansion. Mom wasn't just protecting her social reputation anymore. She was selling confidence. Confidence built on forged paperwork. At exactly 9:18 p.m., Tiffany floated through the ballroom wearing another custom gown that probably cost more than my truck. She spotted me near the kitchen doors. Her smile disappeared. She crossed the room without excusing herself from the people she had been entertaining. "There you are." I wasn't hiding. "You were supposed to stay back here." "I am back here." She folded her arms. "You know what I mean." "I usually do." She rolled her eyes. "Can't you make one thing easy?" "I've made plenty of things easy." She didn't understand the sentence. Neither did I expect her to. She glanced toward the ballroom entrance. "Mom wants to see you." "I'm sure she does." Without waiting for my answer, Tiffany turned and walked away, expecting me to follow. Some habits survive adulthood. She still believed everyone naturally walked behind her. I followed at my own pace. Near the entrance to the ballroom stood my mother. She wasn't smiling anymore. The second she saw me, she took my elbow with surprising force and guided me toward a quiet alcove beside the grand staircase where the music covered most conversations. "Where have you been?" she demanded. "Helping the caterers." "Good." She actually sounded pleased. "That's where people expect you." I looked at her for a moment. "I flew halfway around the world for Dad's funeral." She blinked. "I came home for this family." Nothing. Not even a flicker. Instead, she opened a leather portfolio. "I need one signature." She removed a document clipped neatly to a presentation folder. "It's routine." I accepted the packet without speaking. The title immediately caught my attention. Family Trust Consolidation, Authorization. Interesting choice. Not accurate, just interesting. I slowly flipped through the pages. Most of the language looked intentionally harmless. Administrative restructuring, asset management efficiency, updated beneficiary records. Then I reached page 7. There it was. A cross-reference to the refinancing package I had downloaded from the lender. Same property description. Same loan identification number. Different cover page. They had disguised the authorization inside family trust language. Not sophisticated. Just deceptive enough that someone signing quickly might never notice. Mom watched my face carefully. "It's only paperwork." "No." "What?" "It's not." She inhaled slowly. Don't start creating problems. I'm reading. You've never cared about financial matters before. Another incorrect assumption. I looked up. Who drafted this? Our attorney. Name? She didn't answer. Because she couldn't. Tiffany appeared beside her carrying an expensive fountain pen. She held it out toward me with an impatient smile. Sign it. No. Her smile froze. You didn't even finish reading. I finished the important parts. Mom's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. You don't understand what's at stake. I think I do. She stepped closer. Close enough that only I could hear her. If you refuse. She paused deliberately. I'll tell every newspaper in Savannah that you've been mentally unstable since your father died. I didn't move, she continued. I'll explain that your military service left you emotionally damaged. Another pause. I'll say you've become paranoid and delusional. Tiffany stood silently beside her, still holding out the pen, almost like a child waiting for someone to autograph a birthday card. Mom wasn't finished. I know editors. I know reporters. I know people at every charity board in this city. She smiled. A decorated officer having a public breakdown after losing her father? She tilted her head. They'll print that story before lunch. I studied her face. Not because I doubted the threat, because I realized she genuinely believed it would work. She thought reputation frightened me more than dishonesty. She had spent decades surrounded by people who lived exactly that way. Then she delivered her final offer. Sign this. She tapped the signature line with one perfectly manicured fingernail. We'll all move on. Tiffany lifted the pen another inch toward my hand. Her expression carried complete confidence. They believed I was cornered. They believed they possessed every advantage. They believed the woman standing in front of them had arrived, carrying nothing but old luggage and hurt feelings. Neither of them noticed the evidence folder resting quietly beneath my trench coat. And neither of them had any idea that before midnight, someone far more difficult to intimidate than me would walk through those ballroom doors. I let the pen hang in the air between Tiffany's fingers and my hand without touching it. The silence irritated my mother far more than another argument would have. Well, she whispered. I said no. Her jaw tightened. You are making a terrible mistake. No. Slipped the unsigned document back into her leather portfolio. You are. She snatched the folder away before anyone nearby could notice. For half a second, I thought she might slap me. Instead, she forced another smile onto her face. Years of charity galas had taught her how to switch expressions faster than most people change television channels. There you are, she called loudly to a passing developer, as if we'd just finished discussing family vacation plans. I stepped away without another word. The ballroom was packed now. Nearly every table was occupied. Crystal glasses reflected the light from 3 enormous chandeliers suspended above the polished dance floor. A string quartet performed near the fireplace, while waiters carried silver trays between 100 conversations worth millions of dollars. People weren't here for New Year's. They were here to invest in each other. Business cards disappeared into tailored suit pockets. Promises were exchanged over champagne. Mom moved effortlessly from one circle to another. Our family has always believed in preserving Savannah's heritage. We're considering several exciting partnerships. My late husband built an extraordinary legacy. Every sentence sounded rehearsed. Every smile looked rented. I stood near one of the rear columns, where I could see almost the entire ballroom. Observation had always been easier than participation. A familiar voice interrupted my thoughts. The young waiter from earlier quietly approached with a glass of sparkling water. I figured you weren't drinking tonight. You figured right. He handed me the glass. I've worked events here for 3 years. Oh? I've never seen someone smile. As much as your mother tonight. I looked toward the center of the ballroom. Neither have I. He hesitated. Can I ask something? Go ahead. Are you really just some government office worker? I almost laughed. What makes you ask? You don't carry yourself like one. What do I carry myself like? He thought about it. Like somebody who doesn't panic. I smiled. That's a useful skill. He nodded once before returning to work. Dad would have liked him. He noticed behavior instead of appearances. Across the room, Tiffany had gathered another small audience. She lifted her engagement ring again. Someone admired it. Someone else admired the wedding venue. Another guest asked where the honeymoon would be. Amalfi Coast, Tiffany answered proudly. We'll spend 3 weeks there. One man whistled. That isn't cheap. She laughed. Dad always wanted me to dream big. I looked down at my water. No. Dad wanted craftsmanship, responsibility, integrity. The expensive dreams belonged to someone else. Then everything changed. The ballroom doors opened, not dramatically, not violently, just firmly enough that both heavy oak panels swung inward together. The quartet stopped playing in the middle of a measure. Conversations faded one after another. People turned instinctively. An army dress uniform has a way of commanding attention before the person wearing it even speaks. Brigadier General Silas Montgomery stepped through the doorway, wearing full army service dress blues. Every ribbon sat perfectly aligned. Every button reflected the chandelier light. His silver stars caught the room before his face did. Behind him walked two uniformed military escorts. Their posture alone changed the atmosphere. Nobody announced them, nobody needed to. The ballroom separated almost automatically, creating a clear path through the center. Whispers rippled across the guests. Is that a general? Who invited him? The army. I didn't know the Pendletons had military connections. Mom's eyes lit up. Of course they did. A decorated general attending her gala? She immediately assumed he had come because of her. Or because of Tiffany's future in-laws. Either explanation suited her perfectly. She hurried across the ballroom before anyone else could reach him. Her smile returned in full force. General Montgomery, she exclaimed warmly. What an incredible honor. She extended her hand. I'm Priscilla Pendleton, hostess for this evening. Thank you so much for joining. The general never slowed down, not even slightly. Her hand remained suspended in the air. He walked straight past it, straight past her, straight down the center aisle. The silence became almost uncomfortable. Mom turned, confused. For perhaps the first time in her adult life, someone important had looked directly through her instead of at her. She tried again. General? Nothing. He continued walking. Every polished shoe struck the ballroom floor with calm, measured precision. 1, 2, 3. He stopped exactly 1 arm's length in front of me. For just a moment, neither of us spoke. I recognized the look in his eyes immediately. Professional, steady, respectful, not theatrical, not sentimental, simply correct. Then Brigadier General Silas Montgomery snapped his heels together. The sound echoed across the silent ballroom. His white-gloved right hand rose sharply, a flawless military salute. Every soldier in the room, active, retired, or former, would have recognized its precision. My instincts responded before conscious thought. I returned the salute. The movement felt natural, familiar, earned. Gasps spread through the ballroom. Champagne glasses paused halfway to people's lips. Several guests looked from the general to me, then back again. Nobody seemed able to reconcile the woman in the plain beige trench coat with what they were witnessing. The general lowered his hand. His voice carried effortlessly across the room. Major Pendleton. Every conversation stopped completely. The chief of engineers sends his regards. I appreciate that, sir. He also instructed me to personally thank you for your leadership during Operation Granite Crossing. I answered the only way military protocol allowed. It was my privilege to serve. It was also your planning that restored humanitarian access for nearly 40,000 civilians. The room stayed frozen. Mom stared at me as though she'd never seen me before. Tiffany looked even worse. Her confident smile had disappeared completely. One of Oliver's relatives quietly asked another guest, "Did he just call her Major?" Nobody answered. General Montgomery continued, "I apologize for arriving without notice." "No apology necessary, sir." He nodded once. "I was already in Georgia for official business." That part was true. I considered appropriate to deliver my specs in person, after learning you were on authorized leave. Another pause. Then he smiled slightly. Not broadly. Just enough that I recognized the expression I'd seen after difficult missions finally ended successfully. "You've made the Corps proud." "Thank you, sir." He reached into the inside pocket of his dress coat. Several people leaned forward, expecting another medal. Another certificate, another surprise. Instead, he removed a sealed official envelope bearing the insignia of the United States Army Corps of Engineers. He held it, but didn't open it. Not yet. My mother finally found her voice. There must be some misunderstanding. General Montgomery turned toward her for the first time all evening. There is. His expression remained perfectly professional. But not on Major Pendleton's side. I saw my mother's confidence crack, not shatter, not yet. Just enough for the first real uncertainty to appear behind her carefully perfected smile. And I knew the evening had finally reached the point where pretending was no longer going to save anyone. I lowered my salute as General Montgomery stepped half a pace to my side, giving me the space to speak for myself. That was intentional. The Army had never taught me to hide behind rank. It taught me to stand on my own. The ballroom remained completely silent. 150 people watched without pretending to carry on their conversations anymore. Even the catering staff had stopped moving. My mother forced out a nervous laugh. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding," she said, looking toward Charles and Evelyn Blackwell before anyone else. "Audrey has always had a vivid imagination." Nobody laughed with her. She tried again. "She's really just helping the family." The words came out weaker this time. "She assists with things." Charles Blackwell slowly took a step away from her. His wife followed without saying a word. Then Oliver, Tiffany's fiancé, quietly released Tiffany's hand. He didn't make a scene. He simply created distance. That small movement spoke louder than any accusation, my mother noticed. "Tiffany," she whispered, "stand closer." My sister didn't move. Her eyes stayed fixed on the rows of ribbons visible beneath the opening of my trench coat. I had spent years earning those ribbons one deployment at a time. She was seeing them for the first time. General Montgomery folded his hands behind his back and remained silent. He wasn't here to rescue me. He was here to make sure nobody questioned who I was once the truth came out. My mother pointed at me with a trembling finger. "She's confusing everyone." "No," I answered calmly. "I'm correcting the record," she swallowed. "You've embarrassed this family enough." I almost smiled. "The evening isn't over." The young waiter from earlier stood nearby, still holding a tray of untouched champagne flutes. I turned toward him. "Would you mind helping me for a second?" His eyes widened. "Yes, ma'am." I slipped the beige trench coat from my shoulders and handed it to him. He accepted it carefully. The room seemed to inhale all at once. Several women covered their mouths. Someone near the back whispered, "Oh my God." The Army service dress uniform underneath had been pressed before I left my temporary quarters. Dark blue coat. Perfectly aligned brass buttons. Major's gold oak leaves on each shoulder. Combat ribbons arranged exactly according to regulation. Expert qualification badge. Overseas service bars. Nothing exaggerated, nothing decorative, everything earned. The same people who had looked through me when I wore a trench coat were now staring as though I had become someone else. I hadn't. They had simply decided the uniform deserved more respect than the woman wearing it. That realization never stopped disappointing me. My mother's face turned almost white. "You." She couldn't finish the sentence. "You told everyone I pushed paperwork." I looked directly at her. "You weren't completely wrong." A few confused expressions appeared around the ballroom. "I do paperwork." I paused. "I just happened to do it after rebuilding bridges under enemy fire." A nervous laugh escaped someone in the crowd. Another guest quickly stopped himself. General Montgomery spoke, without raising his voice. Major Pendleton commanded logistics coordination during multiple reconstruction operations. Nobody interrupted him. Several of those operations remained classified. The room became even quieter. I reached for the leather messenger case resting beside my chair. Every movement was slow, deliberate. There was no reason to rush now. The truth had waited long enough. I opened the case and removed the waterproof document sleeve. My mother watched every motion. "What are you doing?" "Finishing Dad's last project." I slid the official envelope from the sleeve. The county certification seal caught the chandelier light. Charles Blackwell adjusted his glasses. I recognized those documents. Of course he did. His company had purchased enough historic properties over the years to know exactly what official real estate paperwork looked like. I unfolded the papers carefully. No dramatic gestures, no speeches, just facts. I walked to the long, polished mahogany table, where my mother had spent the evening receiving congratulations. Half-finished champagne glasses still rested there, flower arrangements, investment brochures, place cards. I laid the original certified warranty deed flat beside my mother's crystal glass. The paper barely made a sound against the wood. Every eye followed it. Charles stepped forward first. "May I?" "You may." He bent slightly to read the first page. His expression changed almost immediately. He flipped to the certification page. Then, back again, he looked toward me. "This is the original recorded deed." "Yes." He checked the recording information one more time. "It appears authentic." "It is." My mother finally found enough breath to speak. "No." She shook her head repeatedly. "That's impossible." "It isn't. Bernard left this house to me." I met her eyes. "No, you don't know what you're talking about." I know exactly what I'm talking about. She reached toward the document. I placed one hand calmly over the lower corner before she could touch it. You boasted about inheriting this house, Mother. My voice stayed low, steady. The entire ballroom leaned in to hear. But you cannot inherit what was never yours. Her lips parted. My father left the deed to me. Silence. Complete silence. The words settled over the room heavier than any shout could have. My mother stared at the signature page, then at the county seal, then back at me. She looked like someone trying to solve a puzzle after realizing half the pieces had belonged to another box all along. This, she swallowed hard. This has to be fake. Charles Blackwell answered before I could. If this certification number matches county records. He looked toward his attorney, who happened to be attending the gala. Then it would be extraordinarily difficult to fake. The attorney stepped forward. May I examine it? I nodded. He spent nearly a full minute reviewing every page. His thumb paused over the raised county seal. He checked the recording stamp, then the notarization. Finally, he looked directly at Priscilla. I would strongly advise against calling this fraudulent without evidence. My mother took one unsteady step backward. Tiffany looked at the floor. For the first time in her life, she couldn't think of anything clever to say. The ballroom no longer belonged to my mother. It belonged to the truth. And resting inside my messenger case were the documents that would prove this deed was only the beginning of everything they had tried to steal. I closed the document sleeve and rested my hand on it while the ballroom dissolved into dozens of hushed conversations. Nobody cared about the champagne anymore. Nobody cared about midnight. Every eye kept drifting back to the warranty deed lying on the mahogany table. People who had spent years admiring my mother's confidence, studying her for signs they had backed the wrong person. Funny how quickly expensive friendships becomes cautious acquaintances. Charles Blackwell handed the deed back to me with both hands. I appreciate you allowing me to review it. Thank you for treating it professionally. He nodded. I've bought enough historic properties to know an original county recording when I see one. Then he turned toward my mother. Priscilla, I think we're going to pause any business discussions tonight. He chose his words carefully. Experienced businessmen usually do. Evelyn Blackwell quietly slipped her arm through her husband's. Neither of them looked angry. They looked disappointed. That expression hurt people like my mother far more than shouting ever could. Across the ballroom, Tiffany hurried toward Oliver. Say something. Oliver looked exhausted. What would you like me to say? Tell them this is ridiculous. I don't know if it is. She grabbed his arm. You believe me, don't you? He glanced toward the deed. I believe paperwork. That single sentence landed harder than an insult. Tiffany slowly let go of his sleeve. Near the back of the room, a man in a navy suit had remained unusually quiet throughout the evening. I'd noticed him earlier because he never drank the champagne offered to him. He carried a leather portfolio instead. His name tag read, Bradley Mercer, Senior Lending Officer, Atlantic Heritage Capital. Exactly the name I'd seen inside the refinancing application. Our eyes met. Recognition appeared almost instantly. He walked toward the table without saying a word. Major Pendleton? Yes. I'm Bradley Mercer. I know who you are. His eyebrows lifted slightly. I'm afraid I don't understand. I've read your loan file. His expression changed, not defensive, concerned. He opened his portfolio and removed several documents. I was scheduled to finalize a refinancing package after New Year's. I know. He compared the application in his hands with the original warranty deed still lying on the table. His forehead tightened. This? He turned another page. Doesn't match. No, it absolutely doesn't. He checked the borrower section again, then Bernard's signature, then mine, then back to the deed. I need an explanation, so do I. My mother stepped forward quickly. There has to be some paperwork mix-up. Bradley looked directly at her. Mrs. Pendleton. He held up the application. This package identifies you as the legal property owner. I am. No. Charles Blackwell answered before I could. Apparently she isn't. The room became quiet again. Bradley removed his reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. I need to ask a very direct question. He looked at me. Did you authorize this refinance? I did not. Did you sign these documents? I did not. He nodded once. Understood. I reached into my messenger case. There are 2 more documents you should see. I removed the first report. Prepared by Sandra Whitaker, licensed forensic document examiner. 31 years of courtroom testimony. I slid it across the table. Bradley opened it immediately. His eyes moved rapidly across the pages. Signature pressure analysis, ink flow comparison, stroke sequencing, microscopic inconsistencies. Every conclusion reached the same result. Bernard Pendleton's signature had been forged. A few pages later, Audrey Pendleton's signature had also been forged. Bradley looked up slowly. This report is certified. Yes, by Sandra Whitaker? She completed it yesterday. He continued reading. Then I placed one final packet beside it. This one matters even more. Certified digital forensic records, internet protocol logs, authentication timestamps, submission history, every electronic upload connected to the refinancing package, every login, every revision, every digital signature request. The originating IP address appeared repeatedly. One residential internet account, registered to Priscilla Pendleton. The ballroom fell silent for the third time that evening. Bradley read the address twice. Then a third time, he slowly closed the folder. I don't believe there's any ambiguity left. My mother finally snapped. This is absurd, she pointed at me. She's trying to destroy her own family. No, I answered calmly. I'm stopping someone from committing another crime. I didn't forge anything, Bradley looked at her. Mrs. Pendleton. His voice remained perfectly professional. This report indicates the loan application originated from your residence. You can't prove who used the computer. No, I nodded, but investigators can. Almost on cue, the heavy oak ballroom doors opened once more. This time nobody mistook the reason. Two uniformed Chatham County Sheriff's deputies walked inside. Not rushing, not dramatic, simply doing their job. Several guests instinctively stepped aside. The older deputy approached me first. Major Pendleton? Deputy Collins. He nodded. We received the federal fraud documentation you submitted this afternoon. I assumed you had. We also spoke with the county prosecutor. He accepted the evidence folder from my hands. Thank you. Bradley immediately reached into his portfolio. I need to place Atlantic Heritage Capital on emergency notice. He removed his company phone. Effective immediately. He looked directly at my mother. This refinancing transaction is suspended. He tapped several options on his screen, pending investigation. Another notification. Borrower accounts flagged. Another. Fraud department notified. Another. Identity theft protocol initiated. My mother's face lost every trace of color. What does that mean? Bradley answered without emotion. It means no funds will be disbursed, he continued typing. It also means every account connected to this application will undergo enhanced review. Tiffany grabbed her mother's arm. Mom, Priscilla ignored her. You can't freeze my finances. I don't freeze accounts. Bradley slipped his phone back into his pocket. Our fraud division does. Deputy Collins cleared his throat. Mrs. Pendleton, we'd like to ask you several questions. I don't have to answer anything. That's your right. The younger deputy added quietly, but we strongly recommend you speak with counsel before making further statements. Across the ballroom, investors quietly collected their business cards. Developers excused themselves. Charity board members drifted toward the exits. Nobody wanted to be photographed standing beside my mother anymore. The social empire she had spent decades constructing wasn't collapsing because I humiliated her. It was collapsing because trust disappears faster than money. Charles Blackwell looked toward Oliver. I think it's time we leave. Oliver nodded silently. Tiffany reached for him one last time. He stepped back, not cruelly, just carefully. Sometimes a single step says everything words cannot. I watched guests file out beneath the chandeliers while deputies organized evidence, and Bradley finalized the fraud notifications. The mansion hadn't changed. The marble floors were still polished. The crystal still sparkled. The champagne still filled untouched glasses. Only the illusion had disappeared. And once people finally see the truth beneath a beautiful surface, they rarely agree to pretend again. I slipped the new brass key into the front door one last time and listened to the deadbolt lock with a solid, familiar click. For the first time in years, the house was quiet. No string quartet, no champagne glasses, no photographers asking people to smile wider than they felt. Just the sound of waves rolling against the cliffs below the property. The moving trucks had pulled away less than 20 minutes earlier. Everything that belonged to my mother and Tiffany had been removed under the court-authorized 24-hour possession order that followed the emergency injunction. Their furniture, artwork, designer wardrobes, and decorative antiques now sat inside commercial storage units while their attorneys argued over problems that paperwork, not emotion, had already answered. I hadn't stood side to watch them leave. There wasn't any satisfaction in it. Dad never celebrated when someone lost. He believed consequences spoke loudly enough without applause. I carried his toolbox onto the front porch and rested it on the wooden railing overlooking the Atlantic. The ocean stretched across the horizon in a flat sheet of silver. Dad loved this view. Whenever work around the house frustrated him, he'd bring a folding chair onto this porch with a cup of black coffee and sit for 15 minutes before touching another tool. He called it letting the answer catch up. I finally understood what he meant. Sometimes solving a problem isn't about working harder. Sometimes it's about refusing to rush the truth. I opened the toolbox. Everything inside remained exactly where he had left it. Combination square, wood chisels, block plane, small brass hammer, a tape measure with faded pencil marks still visible across the casing. I picked it up. The tape extended smoothly despite its age. Dad bought quality once. He hated buying cheap things twice. A laugh escaped me. He would have had plenty to say about my mother's decorating budget, probably none of it polite. Behind me, footsteps approached across the porch. General Montgomery stopped beside the railing. He had changed into civilian clothes after the deputies completed their interviews, but his posture still announced the army before he spoke. Beautiful place. It is. You keeping it? I looked back toward the mansion. For a moment, I imagined living here, the bedrooms, the gardens. Dad's workshop rebuilt exactly where it used to stand. Morning coffee on the porch, quiet weekends. A life that finally stayed in one place. Then I pictured another family. One that had just lost a husband or wife in uniform. Children trying to understand why home suddenly felt unfamiliar. Parents driving hundreds of miles to military funerals. Spouses filling out paperwork no one should ever have to complete. The answer became obvious. No. He smiled slightly. I thought you might say that. I already signed the transfer documents. He nodded. I heard. The trust had been finalized an hour earlier. The mansion would no longer belong to me as an individual. Instead, it would become permanent housing for the immediate families of fallen service members while they navigated funerals, benefit claims, relocation, counseling, and the first impossible months after loss. The official name appeared on every document. The Bernard Pendleton Memorial Sanctuary. Dad would have been embarrassed by the attention. He also would have secretly loved the purpose. General Montgomery rested both hands on the railing. He would have been proud. I hope so. He would. We stood quietly for another minute. Not every silence needs filling. Eventually, he reached into his jacket and handed me a sealed envelope. The chief asked me to give you this after everything's settled. I opened it. Inside sat official deployment orders. Another reconstruction mission. Another damaged place waiting for engineers instead of headlines. I folded the papers carefully. Report date, 48 hours. Sounds about right, he chuckled. The Army still doesn't know how to schedule vacations. I've noticed. He offered his hand. Not because regulations required it, because respect did. I shook it. Take care of yourself, Major. I'll do my best. After he left, I walked back inside for one final inspection. Empty rooms echoed differently than furnished ones. Without expensive decorations, the craftsmanship Dad loved became easier to see. Original hardwood floors, hand-built stair railings, old brick fireplaces, solid doors that still closed perfectly after decades. Real quality doesn't disappear when the furniture leaves, neither does character. I walked to the entryway and opened the smart lock management panel. The previous access list filled the screen: Priscilla, Tiffany, cleaning service, event coordinator, maintenance contractor, real estate consultant. One by one, I removed every authorization. Delete, 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 delete. Finally, only one user remained, Audrey Pendleton. I entered a new administrative code known only to me, saved the settings, tested the lock. Perfect. The old keys went into my bag, not because I wanted control, because responsibility always belongs to someone. Today, that someone happened to be me. I picked up Dad's toolbox, stepped outside, and locked the front door. The sound felt different this time. Not like an ending, like a promise. I climbed into my truck. The same truck that had looked out of place among luxury cars only a few nights earlier. The engine started on the second turn, just as Dad's old joke predicted. Reliable things usually don't need to impress anyone. As I drove away, the mansion grew smaller in the rearview mirror. Oddly enough, I didn't feel like I was leaving home. I felt like I had finally understood what home was. For years, I thought home was a place someone could give you or take away from you. I was wrong. Home is built every time someone chooses responsibility over pride. Every time someone protects another person without asking for credit. Every time calloused hands quietly fix what loud mouths keep breaking. My mother spent years believing respect could be purchased with expensive addresses, elegant parties, and the approval of wealthy strangers. My father spent his life proving that respect is earned by what you build, what you protect, and how you treat people when nobody important is watching. In the end, the deed wasn't the greatest inheritance he left me. His character was. That turned out to be worth far more than $4 million. And if this story stayed with you, don't stop here. The video waiting on your screen tells another unforgettable family story that viewers return to again and again because the ending changes the way you see everything that came before. Once you watch it, you'll understand exactly why.